Thank you everybody for coming tonight. I'm just going to have just a few brief words because I just want to go and thank some people tonight. Firstly, I just want to thank David Walker for being here. He kind of is the campus director for CUFI. He does tireless work as far as the pro-Israel movement goes. I mean, he's your guy day in and day out. So I think we should all give him a round of applause. Thank Brian Griffin because without him I would be a steam engine with no brakes, or maybe the Hindenburg as it is. I wanted to thank all the groups that co-sponsored me. The John Jay Society went out of their way, did something they didn't normally do to reserve this room for us, so I thank them very much. I want to thank API, Aryeh, who is the pro-Israel group on campus, all these groups. Without their help, Daniela Greenbaum did a whole lot of work in getting people here and helping me organize this, and I kind of was just like lost. So thank all these people. I see some faces that I haven't seen in a while. Andy, Victoria, good to see you guys. And so I thank you on that part. And Bo's here. So anyways, I just wanted to make a short note on that. I really hope that there is opposing voices in the audience tonight. There will be a question and answer session, and I promise that if you do have any sort of opposing opinion, your question, will be addressed and will be answered, but I do hope that you do, wait until we get to the question and answer session to do so. I appreciate your voice, and I hope you appreciate Dumisani's voice. When David Walker and Laura Serban CUFI first, came up with the idea to send Dumisani Washington, Pastor Dumisani here, I just instantly knew it was the right decision. If you go and you watch what he does, he's such an original voice in fighting for Israel. He's a scholarly individual. He has compassion when he speaks, but he also, most importantly, is he says what he believes, and he doesn't apologize for it. And if you believe, like I believe, that Israel is a pressing issue, we are at a crossroads in our time in which we can either fight for Israel or we can do nothing. And whether we believe that Israel's life is on the line, then you believe that he is an extremely important person, in my belief, one of the most important speakers to speak at Columbia this year. And I think that when you have such a contentious issue that is kind of on the precipice of such immense consequences, it's not just important that you stand up for Israel, but it's important how you stand. And if you ask me, I think that Dumisani Washington stands as strong as anybody. And that's why he's here tonight. And so, without further ado, I want to welcome Pastor Dumisani Washington.
Thank you, Ben, and thank you everyone for coming tonight. I'm just housekeeping and stuff out of the way. I'm glad to see you. This was not an original stop. David Walker, my good friend, who's the National Director of Christians United for Israel on campus. Weeks ago, we had a conversation about some of the things that were going on here, which I'll get into in a moment. And I went to David to ask how we need to respond. We recognize that this is, CUFI has, some 150 chapters across the country. So David, along with me, thank you, sir. I'm sorry, I forgot that. Thank you, sir. And I asked David how we should respond to what was going on. Write an op-ed and make some phone calls, whatever. And he said, no, I got a friend. When David says you have a friend, you back up. He made some phone calls, and then he called me about a week later and said, I said, let's go. We'll actually speak. So that's even better. So we're here. We'll do some follow-up afterwards. But I do want to have a conversation. I have the honor and the privilege of serving as the Diversity Outreach Coordinator for the largest pro-Israel organization in the country, Christians United for Israel, over 2.1 million members. I've been associated with CUFI for about 3 years or so. I have friends who work with the organization, admire them, love them very much. And I just officially came on staff back in September. Dave was actually, when I first met him, was the Eastern Region Coordinator for Christians United for Israel on campus, and they have since promoted him over the entire country. A move that we applaud, along with some other ones that have just been tremendous. Our good friend David Brogg is the Executive Director, and he's doing a tremendous job with all that he has pressing on him. So I want to open up with you. Now, a couple things. I walk when I talk. It's not usually a problem except for when the screen is going to be blocked a little bit. So I'll never stand in front of the screen. I'll make my commitment to you that I won't stand. I'll be over there. I might walk in front of the screen. Just so you know, I know that I'm doing that. It's just that it's a habit. But I'll make sure I get out of the way so that you can see everything. CUFI on campus, not just the 150 chapters, but some 500 young people who are extraordinary. I've had the opportunity to be with them in several national events, whether it's San Antonio, where we're based, or in Washington, D.C. They are extraordinary. I mean, these young men and women from different parts of the country, different denominations within the Christian faith, because our main focus is Christians, obviously united with Israel, although there are plenty of non-Christians who are actually a part of our organization. They are multi-ethnic, black, white, Latino, they have a passion. I love being with them. The fact that I have 6 children of my own, when I'm with the 500 of them, is not too much of a switch. And my children are around their ages. My oldest is 25, my youngest is 14. My wife is, sometimes she gets to travel with me. She was with me this last leg of the trip, but not this particular one. But we'll hook up again after this weekend. We head to Alaska on Sunday to do some events up there. And we'll take one day to just try to see the beauty of it, and then the rest of it will be meeting and everything. So let's get into it a little bit, all right? Again, like I said, I have the opportunity to serve with some extraordinary people. The graphic that you see behind you, what we call our field generals, my friend Victor calls us the worker bees. You'll see my friend David Walker up there in the corner, the National Campus Director. Again, Jessica Marsuko, she's actually the Western Region Coordinator for CUFI on campus. Raj Nair and Josh Aarons, over here on the other side, actually over our new millennial outreach called Israel Collective. Doing that extraordinary work. They just promoted a couple of videos, or produced a couple of videos just 3 days ago. They're outstanding. We might get a little clip of one of them today. Our friend Samuel Laurie took over David's position now as the Eastern Region Coordinator. Many of you may know Qasim Hafiz. He's actually Pakistani Muslim, which is more proof that you don't have to be a Christian to be a part of CUFI. And he is one of our outreach coordinators as well. As a matter of fact, while I'm here, I believe he's in Toledo right now. And another kind of contentious situation that's there, not that you're contentious, I'll come to that part in a second. That's my big face there. This is my friend Victor Stursky, who's the Eastern Region Coordinator for, we say the adults, is not what it's called, but you know, not the campus, but the other old people. My friend Randy Neal, the Western Region Coordinator, my friend Lyndon Allen, the Central Region Coordinator. So, there is a, there are several presentations that I'll do over the past year that deal a great deal with the African American community and the Jewish experience, as well as Africa and Israel relations. And one of the reasons why, many of you may know this already, why we're here is because of the fact, two quick things. Number one, about 2 months ago, there was a piece that came out in Alger Minor, keep saying Alger Minor, that listed Columbia as one of the top 10 schools with the most anti-Semitic activity. Now, someone told me that they were top because it was alphabetical order, which may have been the case. But 10, I wouldn't want you to be anywhere near the 10 at all. We know some of why, but let's start there. I'm going to tell you, this is going to be a conversation, like I tell my church when I'm preaching, we're going to walk a little journey. Some of the journey is going to be a little uncomfortable. I'm telling you that now. I'm going to say some very controversial. I don't say things that are controversial for the purpose of being controversial. I don't need the drama. I have a big life. I have lots of stuff to do. I say it because I feel it needs to be said. Does that mean I'm always right? No. But I'm going to tell you exactly what I'm feeling. I'm going to back it up, and then we can have a discussion. So let's jump into it. So when African Americans who know their history hear anti-Semitism, we recoil as well, because the same people who perpetrate anti-Semitism hate us with a passion. So when we think anti-Semitism, Holocaust deniers, anti-Zionists even, we think of groups like the Klan, we think of things like Jim Crow lynchings. It's not happenstance that the one ethnic group most represented with the African American community in its struggle for justice was Jewish. That didn't mean that other people weren't present, and other religious faith, Catholic, Presbyterian, but there was no demographic more present in terms of per capita than the Jewish people. And what you see there is one of the reasons why You have the Klan there denying the Holocaust, and you also have Klan members, and they're at a lynching. When they would lynch African Americans during those times, they would literally have picnics afterwards. They're like the body would smolder, and the children would get together, and they would lay out blankets, and they would eat under the body. They would actually take pieces of the charred body, because they usually burn it afterwards, and they would take it home as souvenirs. I mean, as recently as this, you would see, people would have them in their homes still of a person's body. So when you say anti-Semitism for an African American who understands what that means, it resonates with him. Although he may not be Jewish, he knows that it's a shared plight. Not only that, but one of the main reasons why we did it was this. The Black Students Organization based here wrote a piece, I guess it was on social media, and it got picked up in one of the electronic intifada pieces or whatever. And it's too long to go all into it now, but I'm just setting up our conversation. I'm saying if we're going to do the uncomfortable stuff, we might as well jump into it, right, since we're here, right? So I'm going to read a little bit of it. Some of you have seen, how many have seen this before? I don't know how many of you students are over here. A little bit over here. In light of recent flyering campaigns, I didn't know flyering was a word, done by Lion Pack, in which they used the image and words of Martin Luther King Jr., he's actually the Reverend Martin Luther King, in favor of their Zionist views, was the Columbia University Black Students Organization right to condemn their co-optation of black liberation struggle for the purposes of genocide, oppression, and we proclaim our critical blah, blah, blah. Anyway, so then the next part right here, we encourage, how to say that word again? Aryeh. Okay, I'm sorry. Aryeh and their supporters to be more deeply explore the relationship of blackness to Palestinian liberation. We're going to do that in a moment. And it's Israel before they continue to leverage our legacy and heritage in their favor. Until then, from Ferguson and Harlem and Staten Island, Chicago to Cleveland, Ohio, and Port Gibson, Mississippi, I'm sure you put Baltimore on there by now, to Gaza, we stand on the side of liberation and justice. So what's unfortunate about this, among the many things, is that it's so convoluted. And so both as a pastor, as a father, as someone who takes his role as a leader in the black community very seriously, when I see black students say this type of things, I know there's a great deal of confusion. And I take it personally. I mean, not that I'm going to ground them or anything like that. It depends on how contentious the conversation gets. But I want to set stuff straight. Now, I recognize that I don't see very many African Americans other than myself and David, which is cool. So you'll know I do this all over the country. I just was with a group of pastors in San Bernardino the other day. Because sometimes they'll ask me after I have these kind of events, and there's hardly any African Americans there. Are you talking to the black community? Yes, we're talking to the black community. No problem. Yeah, they may not have been here today. Got it. So, but I want to address that for the purposes of our theme here today. So let's move forward. I usually start here because, well, I'm a Christian, I'm a pastor. There'll be some scriptures. I'm not going to preach to you. I get a little loud. There's not going to be an altar call. I'm not going to ask who wants to receive Jesus as their Savior. I just don't want you to get all uncomfortable. People start reading some Bible and they're like, oh my God, and we'll be around. But I need to do this because I need to first and foremost establish something. We'll come back to the confusion of those other statements a little bit later, but let's deal with Christian Zionism because we want to make sure that we're talking about the same thing. Essentially, Christian Zionism is the Christian belief that the Jewish people are God's chosen, that the land of Israel is theirs. Now, I'm back to those scripture. That does not mean that if you don't have that worldview, I'm trying to put it off on you. You with me? In other words, one of the really bad things about the politically correct climate that we live in now is that people can't say what they think. See what I'm saying? I'm telling you what I feel. I'm not trying to convert you to what I feel. Now, do Christians believe that Jesus is the Messiah? Yes, hence the whole Christ thing. Do we know that our Jewish brothers and sisters don't believe that? Yes. That has nothing to do with Christian. Christian Zionism has nothing to do with the conversion of the Jewish people. It has nothing to do with getting the Jewish people saved in Jesus' name. It has everything to do with a Christian understanding that they stand solidly in support of the Jewish people. With me? So now, Exodus 4:22, a couple of scriptures. Then say to Pharaoh, this is what the Lord says, Israel is my firstborn son. Christian Zionism says that's true. That when God said Israel is my firstborn son, he actually meant it. Psalm 135 verse 4, for the Lord has chosen Jacob to be his own, Israel to be his treasured possession. Jacob, Israel, your Bible student, history, the same person. One patriarch, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Jacob's name changed to Israel. When God says he's my treasured possession, Christian Zionism says that's true. That's all it is. Okay. Jeremiah 31:35-36, thus says the Lord who gives the sun for light by day and the fixed order of the moon and the stars for light by night, who stirs up the sea so that its waves roar, the Lord of hosts is his name. As preachers, we love that text because God's just announcing himself. He hasn't actually made the announcement yet. He just said, I'm the person talking. And then he says, if this fixed order departs from before me, declares the Lord, then shall the offspring of Israel cease from being a nation before me forever. The Hebrew word, my Jewish friends tell me, for forever is vayeh, and it means the same thing it means in English. Forever. So Christian Zionism says that when God says forever, he actually meant forever. There's no expiration on it. That's what actually Christian Zionism means. Jeremiah 29, 10 and 11. This is what the Lord says, when 70 years are completed for Babylon, I will come to you and fulfill my good promise to bring you back to this place. The next verse, which is verse 11, within the Christian faith, particularly within the evangelical Christian faith, we know that scripture very, very well. Many songs have been written, really award-winning songs that have been written. But I'm going to turn to that in a second. One of the reasons why I use this scripture to denote Christian Zionism in terms of the Christian belief in the scriptures is that this particular one, if you know Bible history, Jeremiah writes it during the time of Israel's exile. Jerusalem has been destroyed, the temple has been razed, the walls knocked down, and one of the big things that happened to the Jewish people. They've been killed, they've been exiled to the Babylonian Empire, or they're living in squalor in Jerusalem. Jeremiah gets the last one. He's living in squalor, his brothers and sisters are in Jerusalem, and they're longing for the day that they can come home. As a matter of fact, they so want to come home, they said, we're going to go home now. We had a dream, we're going to go home. Jeremiah says, slow your roll. 70 years, you're going to be there. But then he says, I know the plans I have for you, says the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope in the future. Christian Zionism says that even when Israel was in exile, God did not change his mind about Israel. That's what Christian Zionism is. It doesn't matter whether Israel was in the land, exiled from the land, if there's a remnant in the land, it had nothing to do with when God said forever. Amos 9:15, not only that, Amos says, I will plant Israel in their own land, never again to be uprooted from the land I have given them, says the Lord your God. Once again, that word ever and never again, God says, I'm going to bring Israel back. Genesis 15:5, and I hope this is lined up on here, we'll see. Genesis 15:5, God took Abram outside and said, look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. Then he said to him, so shall your offspring be. Now, if I did this the right way, I should be able to have this one there. So, there's two metaphors that God used when he spoke to Abraham. He said, your offspring shall be like the stars in the sky and like the sands on the seashore. In other words, innumerable. So that stars in the sky, and we don't believe it was happenstance, because then the writer of the Psalm 147 says, the Lord builds up Jerusalem, he gathers the exiles, is that word again? He gathers the exiles of Israel, he heals the brokenhearted, he binds up their wounds. Last verse, he determines the number of stars and calls them each by name. Christian Zionism says that God is so awesome that he has the ability to call the scattered children of Israel back from the four corners of the earth, even though they're as numerous as the stars in the sky. Why? Because God says, I know the stars by name. This actual scripture here deals with the exile and then the return, what we call the redemption, our Jewish friends call the redemption, this is again God's returning the children of Israel back. Christian Zionism says God has the ability to do that and believe that 1948 was the beginning of that happening once again. Now, New Testament for the Christians in the house. I asked them, did God reject his people? By no means. I am an Israelite myself, a descendant of Abraham from the tribe of Benjamin. This is Paul talking, a Jewish man who actually becomes a Christian. He lets the Christians know that no, God hasn't rejected his people. Paul was so smart, he actually preached against replacement theology before it took root. Replacement theology is the false teaching in the church that somehow when the age of the church came in, they replaced the Jewish people. That somehow the chosen became the Christians and the Jews became dismissed. It is a false teaching, and Paul warned them. He actually said that there were some of the branches that have been broken off, and you, though a wild olive shoot, have been grafted in among the others and now share in the nourishing sap from the olive root, one of my favorite texts. Do not consider yourself to be superior to those other branches. If you do, consider this. You do not support the root, but the root supports you. Paul's talking to Gentile Christians. They're coming into the faith. And he says the root is Israel. God's never going to replace Israel. He said, don't ever get it twisted in your mind that the Jewish people don't belong to God anymore. He warned. Unfortunately, the church didn't heed it because if anybody knows anything about church history, it became the main weapon of anti-Semitism on the planet. The blood-stained hands of those who called themselves Christians did more damage to the Jewish people than any other single entity. And it was because we did not heed the words that were given, and we believe we're in a moment in time now to correct some of those past wrongs. So, having done that quick one, we also recognize that Zionism is the language also of justice. Why do we say that? Because the word justice, in the Hebrew tzedek, which is righteousness, which is also giving to the poor, is most clearly understood in the Hebrew prophets than in the other place. Let's see what I mean. Deuteronomy 16:20, that's the first one. Justice and only justice you shall follow, that you may live and inherit the land the Lord your God is giving you. God speaks about justice, about right, through his prophets. Micah 6:8, he has told you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you but to do justice, and to love kindness or mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. One of my favorite ones, Isaiah 1:17, learn to do good, seek justice, rebuke the oppressor. This line here from Isaiah is the original speak truth to power. Rebuke the oppressor. He said, just don't feel bad about it. Say something. Open your mouth and then call out those who are oppressing. Bring justice to the fatherless. Plead the widow's cause. This is a very, very relentless text. It says, seek to do good. Set right things that are wrong. God says this in the prophets. And this particular one. But let justice roll down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream. Some of you who are my age and a little bit older, you'll recognize that text in more than one context. Let justice roll down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream. I'm going to pretend like I'm in church. Okay, let's read it together. It says what?
Let justice roll down like water.
There you go, yeah. That's as close as you're going to get to church today, all right? Here we go.
There are those who ask in the devotees of civil rights, when will you be satisfied? We can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of the unspeakable horrors of police brutality. We can never be satisfied. As long as our body is heavy with the fatigue of travel, cannot gain lodging in the motels of the highways and the hotels of the city. We cannot be satisfied as long as the Negro's basic mobility is from a smaller ghetto to a larger one. We can never be satisfied as long as our children are stripped of their selfhood and robbed of their dignity by signs stating for whites only. We cannot be satisfied as long as a Negro in Mississippi cannot vote, and a Negro in New York believes he has nothing for which to vote. No, we are not satisfied, and we will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream.
Though Dr. King was no doubt the most prolific of his day, the interweaving of the Hebrew text into contemporary society was very, very commonplace in black church. He was doing something that was done on that day in August 1963, that was done in black churches all over the country on every Sunday. We preach liberation, justice, strength. It goes all the way back to the days on the slave plantation. Most of what we call the Negro spirituals, the vast majority of them are rooted in the Hebrew text. Go down Moses, swing low, sweet chariot, Elijah rock, Joshua took the battle of Jericho, did my Lord deliver Daniel, and on and on and on. Because this was knowledge that we actually brought with us from Africa. We already knew who Moses was before we left. Why? We look at the map, there's Israel, there's Ethiopia, there's Egypt. So the struggle in terms of justice and freedom was very much what we had. The president, Barack Obama, during his first election, 2007, 2008, called himself the Joshua generation. Hebrew metaphor. What does that mean? That meant that Dr. King's generation, for him, was the ones that were the Moses that brought them through the wilderness. And then he would represent the ones who would take them to the quote-unquote promised land. Dr. King, his very last speech, the day before he was killed, he used Hebrew metaphor. I want you to know that I might not get there with you, but I want you to know that we as a people will get to the promise. That was completely black church all the time. The songs that we would sing. We're marching to Zion, beautiful, beautiful Zion. It's one of the oldest songs that we sing in our hymnals. And Lauryn Hill made it even more famous in the 1990s when her award Grammy, multi-platinum, multi-Grammy award-winning album, Miseducation of Lauryn Hill, she basically takes that song from her first son to Zion. It's what we call spiritual Zion. Spiritual Zionism, a lot of that in the black church, to this day, for the last several hundred years. So one of the reasons why we bring that up is because when you're talking about what a Christian Zionist is, and you're talking about Dr. King, you're talking about arguably the most famous Christian Zionist of the 20th century. Now, the scriptures that we looked at very briefly, he knew them all and more. His doctorate was in theology. But we don't have any public record of him ever preaching biblical Zionism. No way. I wrote a book called Zionism in the Black Church, and I surmise why, because nobody really knows why. I mean, I just surmise that the man was just too smart to argue Bible things in secular context. Whenever he made a case for Israel, it was always on the side of right and justice. And you're going to see that in a second. So, also, I need to say a little bit about, not has to do with him, the Baptist, he was a Baptist preacher. The Baptist denomination is the largest African-American denomination in the country to this day, even though there's lots of multi-denominational or even non-denominational churches and everything. That spiritual Zionism thing goes really, really deep. I remember those songs, and he's old enough to be my grandfather, but we sang some of the same songs and heard some of the same types of messages and everything. So there was a great deal of affinity when it came to what we call the Israelite people. So, March 25th, 1968, Dr. King was the honored guest at the 68th Annual Convention for the Rabbinical Assembly of Conservative Judaism. Two things you need to know about this date. Number one, it's literally 10 days before he's assassinated. He is taken from us on April the 4th, 1968. Number two, it's almost a full year after the 1967, or what the Jewish people call Six-Day War. That happened in the first week of June. This is more than 9 months later. We're coming up on a year. The spring from 1967, now we're in the spring of 1968. A couple other things you need to know about 1968, for those of you who are younger, like again, I'm old enough to know if your parents are here. It's a very, very volatile time. If you thought that what was going on now with Ferguson and Baltimore was one thing, it was nothing compared to what was going on in the late 1960s. Race riots and the whole thing. The race riots actually started in earnest around the mid-1960s, which is why I tell the young people who hold the race riot parts of it now, the looting and everything now. I was telling them to be careful. There were buildings that were burned in Watts in 1965 that are still burnt right now. Same thing for Detroit. They never got rebuilt. And we're telling them as older people, protest, be strong, don't destroy your own stuff, because it's probably not coming back. And that's a lot of where this disenfranchisement comes from. He was living in that day. The Vietnam War was raging, and a disproportionate number of African-American young men at 19 years old were dying in this war. So in this convention, it wasn't about Israel. They just talked about everything. They just said, hey, Dr. King, just come. He and Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel were very, very close friends. He was his soldier, if you will. They worked together. Ralph Abernathy, Rabbi Gendler, they worked together in the struggle for justice. And so what's happening here, they say, we just want to talk to you about any number of things. So he says, yes, I'm going to come, not knowing that 10 days later he would be gone. So in that conversation, Israel comes up. Again, lots of things come up, but we don't have time now. This, if you look at it here, everything I'm reading from you is from a transcript. I'm not editing anything. The only thing I've edited is for length's sake. I haven't inserted words. I'm just reading you what was said in context. Because one of the reasons why Dr. King's legacy gets screwed with is because they take what they thought he said and applied it to what they think they wanted to apply it to, and we're going to read it in context. We're not going to read stuff into it, nor are we going to try to put words in his mouth. We're going to say what he said in context. With me? Dr. King, what would you say if you were talking to a Negro intellectual, an editor of a national magazine, and were told, as I have been, that he supported the Arabs against Israel because color is all important in this world? In the editor's opinion, the Arabs are colored Asians and the Israelis are white Europeans. Would you point out that more than half the Israelis are Asian Jews with the same pigmentation as Arabs? Or would you suggest that American Negroes should not form judgments on the basis of color? What seems to you an appropriate or an effective response? And I kid you not, every time I read that question, I'm so glad they're asking that man with this huge brain. I mean, that question right there is enough for a doctoral thesis. Just that question. That's a whole year's worth of work right there. So they ask him this question, and they ask him on several different points. Now, in terms, remember, 1968 older terms. Arabs, they use the term Arabs because the word Palestinian is not yet used to refer to the people in the region on a regular basis. Palestine goes all the way back to the Roman Empire, that word, but Palestinian in terms of the people as an ethnic group was not used till almost 10 years later under Yasser Arafat's PLO. So they're saying Arabs, they're not saying Palestinians. I'm not saying that Palestinians are the people. I'm saying you're not going to read it here because they're not using that word. Negro, of course, is the term that they use for African American back in the late 1960s. So they asked him a question on basically 3 points. The Arabs, the Israelis, and race. So he deals with each of them. He starts with the race part. On the Middle East, we have had various responses. Dr. King said, the response of some of the so-called young militants, again, does not represent the position of the vast majority of Negroes. There are some who are color-consumed, and they see a kind of mystique in being colored, and anything non-colored is condemned. We do not follow that course in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and certainly most of the organizations in the civil rights movement do not follow that course. Pause. The other thing you need to understand about this time here, not only volatile, but there are fissures within the African American civil rights movement. Now, the majority are represented by Dr. King, A. Philip Randolph, Bayard Rustin, Ralph Abernathy, what we call now the stalwarts, if you will. But there is a younger militant movement coming up, noted by, like the Black Panthers, Stokely Carmichael, H. Rap Brown, who's a congressman, and they are frustrated with Dr. King's nonviolent approach. They're sick and tired of it. They're actually calling names like Whitey, Jew lover, too close to Whitey. Yeah. They're being very disrespectful. Of course, they don't know he's going to be dead 10 days later, but they're saying some very, very, very disrespectful. They see them as old and done. They need to pick up guns, and if they're running to fight, then they're irrelevant. So he says the word militant because they're calling themselves militant. He's not choosing that term for them. That's what they're calling themselves. And one of the ways that they're showing that, they're saying that we're tired of him. So Dr. King says here, there are some, meaning in the militant movement, who are color consumed. In other words, everything black is good, everything white is bad. Gee, the more things change, the more they stay the same. He said, we don't follow that course. He echoes his speech from 5 years earlier, not by the color of their skin, or the content of their character. He says, we are not going to judge the Arab-Israeli conflict based on who's black, white, or brown. He doesn't address the multi-ethnic nature of the Jewish people. He just says, that's not the issue. And then he moves to what the issue is. I think that it is necessary to say that what is basic and what is needed in the Middle East is peace. Peace for Israel is one thing. Peace for the Arab side of that world is another thing. Peace for Israel means security, and we must stand with all of our might to protect its right to exist. Its territorial integrity. I see Israel, and never mind saying it, as one of the great outposts of democracy in the world, and a marvelous example of what can be done. How desert land almost can be transformed into an oasis of brotherhood and democracy. Peace for Israel means security, and that security must be a reality. End quote. Real quick. Somebody give us a 5-second synopsis on the 1967 war. Well, young people, tell us what happened, who the players were. You can do it in 5 seconds. Where did they go? Yes, sir.
Israel liberated all the land that belonged to it.
Pretty good. Very good. The original partition. Yes, ma'am. I'm sorry.
Did you get
That's okay. That's good for now. Yes, that's cool. The original partition. Israel was not in possession of Judea and Samaria. After the Six-Day War, Judea and Samaria, Gaza, the Golan, and Sinai. Israel is in possession of lands at this point that it doesn't even possess now. Yet you never hear the word occupier, imperialist. I'm not saying what he would say today. I'm not even saying that he's weighing in on the conflict. I'm saying what he didn't say. When people lie and say he said it. He says, peace for Israel means security. We must stand with all our might to protect its territorial integrity. While it's in possession of land, the Arab League, the whole occupier term, actually gets codified when the Arab League comes together in Khartoum, Sudan. And they develop, they draft this whole resolution, and basically, in a nutshell, no peace with Israel, no negotiations with Israel, no recognition of Israel. We're called the Khartoum No. The international community has latched onto it. Israel is being called occupier in the 1960s. Gee, like now. And they're wanting Dr. King to endorse them. Now, he's much more, what they say about it in the Christian tradition, John said about Jesus, I'm not worthy to place his shoes. So, much more class than me. So I'm not going to say, he's saying, you know what, screw that. I'm going to say what's true. I'm not going to say what other people are wanting me to say. So he says that at a time that it is even more controversial then than it is now. Because the smoldering from that war is still there. The Arab powers are still smarting from that defeat. So if you know about that war, Israel preemptively struck Egypt. And that becomes the linchpin to denigrate Israel. Israel started the war. No, Israel preempted what was already going to be a war. Egypt had excused the UN peacekeepers that were at the Sinai that were supposed to be there kind of monitoring stuff. Good old UN. They said, boo! They grabbed their stuff, peed on themselves, and ran away. And Nasser, the premier of Egypt, he had his thing set up with Syria, with Lebanon. Israel saw what was happening.
Blockade the straits.
Yeah, absolutely, yes. See, that people know the whole story. This is what Dr. King said during the time.
See that Israel must exist and has the right to exist and is one of the great outposts of democracy in the world.
You know, so he used outposts of democracy, oasis.
Outposts of democracy denote things that are around things and are not like it. An oasis is something that's refreshing around desert. An outpost is something that's far away from, it's in a remote location. What's he saying? Israel is surrounded by despotism. He just said it in a very, very poetic way. An outpost of democracy, an oasis. Dr. King said that at a time when Israel was being roundly criticized, but he didn't stop there because that wasn't the whole question. Then he turned his attention to the Arabs. On the other hand, we must see what peace for the Arabs means in a real sense of security on another level. Peace for the Arabs means the kind of economic security that they so desperately need. These nations, as you know, are part of that third world of hunger, of disease, of illiteracy. I think that as long as these conditions exist, there will be tension. There will be the endless quest to find scapegoats. So there's a need for a Marshall Plan for the Middle East where we lift up those who are at the bottom of the economic ladder and bring them into the mainstream of economic security. You can tell this is another era because they didn't really mince words or do that whole politically correct thing. You know what I mean? For example, just saying this word in context of the conflict, that gets tweeted out, that's all we're going to hear. Oh my God! Dr. King called people scapegoats. I'm going to tell you what he's talking about in context. Let's break it down. He's a man of justice. And he's not just concerned with the Israelis. He's concerned with the Arabs. And he says here, they're part of that world of hunger, disease, and illiteracy. What is he talking about? He's talking about poverty conditions. Why is he talking about that? Well, let's just be logical. He's not talking about the whole of the Arab world. Clearly, Egypt is doing fine. They don't have an air force anymore after the '67 war. They have plenty of money. Many of the leaders of the Arab oil-producing states, which we'll talk about some more in a second, plenty of money. He's speaking about the Arabs who have been dispossessed because of the Arab-Israeli wars. He's talking about the refugees. He's saying they're part of that third world hunger, disease, of illiteracy. And he says, I think as long as these conditions exist, there will be what exists? What conditions? Israel is 20 years old, and like a phoenix, has risen from the ashes. Tel Aviv is already a bustling city and continuing to grow. But it's juxtaposed by these Arabs that are living in squalor and refugee camps. Dr. King says, as long as those conditions exist, there will be an endless quest to find a scapegoat. He's a really smart man. Maybe he's talked to a room full of Jewish rabbis. And a scapegoat is the main picture of Yom Kippur. What happens to Yom Kippur? The high priest lays his hands on the goat, confesses the sins of Israel, and sends it out. He's talking to a room full of rabbis and says, if something doesn't change, the world is going to blame you. The man was a prophet. 50 years later, who does the world blame for the Palestinian condition? Israel. That's exactly what Dr. King said. He didn't say you are the problem. He said you're going to be blamed for the problem. And then he says, there needs to be a Marshall Plan. Real quick, 5 seconds, somebody tell us what the Marshall Plan is, real quick. Somebody younger.
Rebuilding Europe after World War II.
Rebuilding Europe after World War II. Billions of dollars, an international effort started here. Dr. King says there needs to be an international effort to bring relief to the suffering of these people so they can be lifted up into the mainstream of economic security. He did not say, Rabbi Heschel is my best friend, I love the Jews, screw everybody. He says, I care about everybody. Peace for Israel means security, and these Arabs that have been dispossessed, they need an economic security. Unfortunately for us, he's gone after that, 10 days later. But Israel's plight is not over, because there's yet another conflict during this time, the 1973 Yom Kippur War. This time the main players are Syria and Egypt, backed by the Soviet Union with a lot of money and a lot of artillery. The former Soviet Union. And this time they launch it on the holiest day of the Hebrew calendar. And unlike '67, Golda Meir's cabinet, some of them tried to get her to preemptively strike again, and she did it. I'm not denigrating her, I'm just saying what actually happened. Caught them off guard, and this war Israel almost lost. A lot of Israelis died. It was so demoralizing, even though they ultimately won. Many Israelis who survived actually left Israel. They said, you know what, this isn't worth it. They went to America and to other places. Matter of fact, the war was so bad that Golda Meir gets on the phone with Richard Nixon, and I'm paraphrasing, goes something like this: please, 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 we need your help. And I'm paraphrasing again, Nixon goes, okay. And even while he's hesitating, the Israelis are dying. So they miraculously win this war. And the Arabs in the Soviet Union are beside themselves. We cannot defeat these Jews. We've tried over and over. They're outnumbered, outgunned, and somehow they keep winning. So you know what? We can't beat them on the battlefield. will delegitimize their existence. So they approached the United Nations. It took a couple of years, and they passed the heinous resolution, Zionism is racism, which was a long time ago, but to this day, when you type in Zionism in Google, racism comes up. It's so connected. And what happened? Well, Dr. King is gone. But see this picture? This is from actually the 1963 Washington. Ralph Abernathy, Dr. King, Coretta Scott King, the only surviving member of this picture, Representative John Lewis, A. Philip Randolph, Bayard Rustin. How does the black civil rights community respond? They form an organization called BASIC, Black Americans to Support Israel Committee. Why? 2 reasons. They were not going to let their legacy be pilfered. Remember that thing I read from the BSO about the pilfering of language? They have it backwards. The black community recognizes that denigrating Israel and delegitimizing Israel was not only an affront to a democracy, and the Jews who had been their friends, it was also stealing from our legacy. Let you see it yourself.
No matter how you feel about the United Nations, it's the one place on planet Earth where nations get together and attempt to speak with one voice. That's why their resolutions can make a big difference. So when people all around the world see that approximately 40% of the UN Human Rights Council resolutions were against just one country, most of us would assume that country must be a really bad place. Perhaps ruled by, say, a genocidal dictator who kills his own people, or maybe a tyrant continually threatening to annihilate another country. But actually, the country that has been condemned more times than every repressive country on Earth combined is a democracy. The only viable democracy in the Middle East, Israel. And with these repeated resolutions against Israel, it's easy to see why so many in the international community perceive Israel as a major cause of world problems. But are all these resolutions really justified? Because whether or not you agree with how Israel is handling its many challenges, when you do a basic comparison, like the number of deaths Israel is responsible for with the number of condemnations they've received, and then make that same comparison with other countries, it paints a surprising picture of a possible double standard. What could explain the enormous imbalance? Quick history lesson. In 1975, Cuba needed to gather support in order to take down the biggest democratic superpower dominating the global schoolyard, the United States. Seeing how the UN is mostly controlled by the democratic superpowers, Cuba, along with other communist nations, finally found a way to even the playing field, because it just so happened that, at the same time, a number of Muslim countries were looking for new, creative ways to gang up on Israel. So the communists realized that by joining the Muslims' anti-Israel coalition, they could create an unstoppable voting bloc inside the UN. Because with every resolution they passed against Israel, they simultaneously discredited Israel's ally, the United States. So in 1975, the newfound communist Muslim voting bloc spearheaded the passing of a UN resolution that officially stated, Zionism is a form of racism. Yes, Zionism. The movement trying to find ways to protect Jews from racism was redefined as racism, which is kind of like saying the civil rights movement is racism and Martin Luther King is a racist. This is why resolution after resolution after resolution against Israel from 1975 until this day easily passes through the UN.
So I was raised with a great deal of pride and affection for my African American community. I was born in Little Rock, Arkansas in 1967, which was still the segregated South. I grew up in California because my family moved when I was 1, so I didn't know anything experientially about the segregated South. I just knew from what my parents told me. My dad's dad was a sharecropper in the rural areas. If you don't think about black history, sharecropper was the one occupation above slave. Many African Americans were sharecroppers after slavery ended because most of us were on rural property. So my father worked the slave that a white slave owner, a landowner owned at the time. My mom was a seamstress. She grew up and she sewed because I was the youngest of 7 children. We didn't have much money, so she made most of our clothes. And so for me, which she was an awesome seamstress, by the way, I understood our community from their stories. Like, I understood what segregation and desegregation was from the dining room table or my mom's sewing room, because we would talk about it. I learned, for example, of the non-monolithic nature of the African American community, just for a quick example, because there was a great deal of debate within the black community about segregation and integration. A great number of African Americans did not want to integrate and go to school with white people. Not so much as a hatred, as much as it was that we knew that all of our schools, because of during segregation, blacks had their own communities, their own teachers, administrators, school districts, everything. And the issue wasn't so much, so for them, going to school with white people, it was having the same tax revenues going to their schools so that their schools had the same opportunity to succeed. My mom graduated from the only black high school that had graduated black students in Arkansas, Scipio A. Jones High School. And that school graduated the future black doctors, lawyers, politicians. My own uncle, her brother, graduated from there, got a medical degree later on, went on to Brown University and became an outstanding physician there. There's an award named after his name. You Google it, Leon I. Adams, and he had done more to nurture more black physicians than anybody else in his day. So they're very proud. And of course, when integration started, that school was shut down. It just sat there for like 20 years. It broke their heart. Somebody drove by, they just saw the school, and they remember their alma mater. So I had a great deal of pride. So in my Israel advocacy, when I came to understanding and studying years ago about the Yom Kippur War, and how the Arab powers and Soviet powers used the mechanism of the UN to steal our story, Arab Muslim lands in which slavery was still legal, and they had the audacity to call Zionism racism. Not to mention the Soviet Union and its long history with anti-black. I mean, to this day, Soviet police still beat up and all kinds of things with people, dark-skinned Russians that live there, because there are black Russians there, actually. Black Russians have been there for a long time. I was abhorred, and I was very angry. I took it personally. And I said, I know that the African-American civil rights movement did not just sit there and let them pass that reprehensible resolution. Zionism is racism. Are you kidding me? I was very, very beside myself. Someone sent me an article, and I found out about BASIC. I literally, Gil Trey wrote a book called Moynihan's Moment, and he talks about BASIC. And it was a cathartic moment for me. I literally sat there at the computer screen. I shed a little tear. I looked at my wife and I said, I knew it. I knew that we didn't just let them do that. And they formed this organization, and many of the who's who of the black community stood with their Jewish brothers and sisters. Zionism is not racism, but the legitimate expression of the Jewish people's self-determination. From our 400-year experience with slavery, segregation, and discrimination, we know that Zionism is not racism. They were pissed off like I would have been. I was so happy about that. Yes, I was happy that they were pissed off. I was like going, whew, I knew somebody said something, and it's directly connected to Dr. King, because these were his closest friends and allies. His own wife and father were a part of this organization. What you're looking at right here is a PDF file of an ad that BASIC took out in the paper on November 23rd, 1975, and some 200 of the who's who of the African American community stood and signed this resolution saying Zionism is not racism. And here there were 7 tenets. We don't have time to do them all, but I'm going to show you just a quick little shot of it here, just the bullets of them. This is what they said in BASIC. We condemn the anti-Jewish blacklist. We believe blacks and Jews have common interests in democracy and justice. Remember, this is 1975, long after the 1967 war. We support democratic Israel's right to exist. Just this last one. Arab oil prices have had a disastrous effect upon blacks in America and in Africa. You may not know what that means. Let me break it down for you. Byron Russell was a pretty smart man. Dr. King surrounded himself with pretty smart people. The UN operates like a democratic body. In order for resolutions to pass, enough nations have to vote on it. So in order for the Soviet Union and the Arab powers to get the African states, which there's 52 of them, to actually vote on it, they coerced them. The oil-producing Arab states told the poor African nations, you vote for this resolution or we're jacking your oil prices up. So if you look at the resolution, most of the African states voted for it. And guess what the Arab powers did anyway? Jack the prices up anyway. Why? Because they're a bunch of Abids. They didn't care about them. They could care less about them. They used them. I told you they're still enslaving Africans. And they voted. They needed them to vote for it. So to this day, they say, well, the African states voted for the resolution. They had to. They didn't have any choice. And a lot of the poverty that we saw that continued to ensue in the 70s and 80s, the We Are the World, Michael Jackson, most of you weren't born then, a lot of it had to do with this resolution. A lot of it had to do with the energy prices that these African states couldn't pay. While they lied and said, we want you to stand on the side of your Arab brothers and sisters. They were using them, pimping them, as we say. That's exactly what happened. And when that happened, you had them stand up and be counted. Of the 200 of the who's who, we don't have time to do them all. I'll just give you a quick shot. Once again, those of you my age and older, you recognize some of those names. From the entertainment industry, from the sports industry. Mrs. Leontine Price, the premier African-American opera diva. Mrs. Rosa Parks. I'm not going to the backs of bucks fame, I'm sorry. All of these people here, some very famous, some you may not have known. But look at this, his father, his wife, They join this organization and say, we stand with Israel and the Jewish people. That's exactly what happened. And they wrote their own papers and op-eds. Representative Barbara Jordan of Texas. As an American, I regret this resolution, but I don't let that piece of paper deter my commitment to the survival of freedom and liberty and democracy in Israel. As a black American who understands racism, I know that it makes no sense to equate it with Zionism. NAACP President Roy Wilkins. The United Nations is composed largely of dictatorial regimes, which test whether the system or combination of systems will accomplish a particular task. The particular task in this instance was to line up solidly with the Arabs against Israel, equating Zionism with race discrimination, and enlisted support for the resolution. This is a smart way of saying this is bullshit. National Urban League President Vernon Jordan. Black people who recognize code words, since we've been victimized by code words like force busing, law and order, and others, can easily smell out the fact that Zionism in this context of the resolution is a code word for anti-Semitism. And former Black Panther Minister of Information Eldridge Cleaver, yes, former anti-Zionist Eldridge Cleaver, became a Zionist. Why? He attempted to kill a cop, so he fled from justice. And he went to the people that told him they were his friends, the communists and the Arabs. His first stop was to Cuba. Fidel Castro treated him worse than he got treated by the FBI. No joke. He felt so self-conscious, he ran away. Then he went to Algeria, where he saw Arab enslavement of Africans right in front of him. He did that crap for 7 years, came back talking about Am Israel High. Two aspects of the recent UN resolution labeling Zionism as racist both shocked and surprised me. Shocked because of all the people in the world, the Jews have not only suffered particularly from racist persecution, they have done more than any other people in the history to expose and condemn racism. Generations of Jewish social scientists and scholars have labored long and hard in every field of knowledge, from anthropology to psychology, to lay bare and refute all the claims of racial inferiority and superiority. To condemn the Jewish survival doctrine of Zionism as racism is a travesty upon the truth. Secondly, I am surprised that the Arabs would choose to establish a precedent condemning racism because it can so easily and righteously be turned against them. And he goes on to talk about why he knows that to be factual. Nelson Mandela. Friends of Yasser Arafat? Yes. The ANC and the PLO are close to this day. It has a lot to do with the crap that's going on in South Africa right now. But he never, ever denied Israel's right to exist. And anyone who says it did is lying. Our support for Yasser Arafat does not mean that the ANC has ever doubted the right of Israel to exist as a state legally. We have stood firmly for the right of Israel to exist within secure borders. June 1990. And last one. Dr. Clarence Jones. He's 82 years young. Dr. King's former attorney. I am always taken a little aback. I'm seeing people quoting Dr. King frequently out of context to develop a thesis, an argument that he would not be in support of the state of Israel. That is absolutely insane. From the standpoint of someone who has represented the great legacy of this extraordinary man, Martin Luther King Jr., I say to my African American brothers and sisters, the time is now for every African American person, every person of stature in the African American community, to come forward and stand with Israel in the alpine chill of winter to show that we are wintertime soldiers. February 28, 2014. From the 60s to now. But we still have a problem. There remains a huge problem. Because Dr. King's stated concern for the Arabs that we talked about is as legitimate now as it was almost 50 years ago. We're getting ready to walk into some uncomfortable stuff right now. So it forces us then to have a modern day conversation about Palestinian human rights. Why? Because Dr. King was concerned. He didn't use the word Palestinian, but I showed you the text. He showed concern for the Arabs, Arab Palestinians. So if Zionism is the language of justice, a Zionist then is naturally not just concerned with Israel's peace and security, but the people who've also been dispossessed. Like Dr. King said. And if you, just in case you don't remember, each of the Arab wars, Arab-Israeli wars, were started by the Arab powers. UN partition, 181. There's a Jewish side and a Palestinian side, or Arab side. It actually created a Palestinian state. The Jews said, yay. Palestinians said, screw you. And that's when the fighting got started. And they've been fighting ever since. Dr. King's well aware of this. So we have to now bring it to now. So if we're going to have a conversation about Palestinian human rights, I love that because I want to be on the side of justice as well. So if we're going to talk about Palestinian human rights, let's have a real conversation. Not an anti-Zionist, genocidal, ridiculous claims conversation. You saw some of those terms I showed you before? The definition of genocide is the destroying of a gene of people. There are more Arab Palestinians now than there were at the time of the petition. Matter of fact, the infant mortality rate went down because of access to Jewish medical supplies, which they shared with everybody, and they continue to. Hamas regularly brings their family members to Jewish hospitals, where they're treated and sent back to Gaza so they can send some more missiles. When Dr. King said an outpost of democracy, of brotherhood, this is what he was talking about. So here, National Students for Justice in Palestine, from their quote, "We believe that in order to restrict structural oppression, we must embody the principles and ideals we envision for a just society." Those words sound really cool, except when they don't mean anything that you're saying. That's why Yasser Arafat called it the Palestinian Liberation Organization. He didn't give a crap about the Palestinians being liberated. He wanted Jews dead. That's why he was willing to sacrifice Palestinians in order to get his objective met. Come here, Ben. If Ben and I are friends, and we're really friends, and we're standing in solidarity, and we're standing shoulder to shoulder working with each other, then we're going to help each other. If I strap a bond to him and send him to you because I don't like you, care about Ben? I didn't think about Ben. I think about me. That's not a struggle for justice. That's narcissism on the highest level. So Dr. King knew it, and so now we need to follow in his footsteps. So let's talk about Palestinian human rights. The second wealthiest terrorist organization on the planet is Hamas. The leader and the ruler of Gaza. There's two Palestinian territories, those of you who don't know. There's Gaza, and there's the Palestinian Authority, called the West Bank. It's Judea and Samaria, but that's all right. We'll have this conversation. How wealthy are they? Well, Khalid Masha'al, the leader, according to Forbes, is worth $2.6 billion. How about Abu Mazen or Mahmoud Abbas? Now this is a lowball figure because this figure was actually from about 5-6 years ago. So we figure it's closer to like $500 million by now. It's a lot of money. When Dr. King said Marshall Plan, brother don't think this is what he was talking about. Do you know that over the last 19 years that the Palestinian leadership have received the equivalent of 25 Marshall Plans? Tens of billions of dollars to go to do exactly what Dr. King said, yet poverty persists in the Palestinian territories. And what did Dr. King tell the rabbis? The world is going to blame. Amazing! The man was prescient. But let's go further. The war, last summer, the IDF let the world know that Hamas had been digging terror tunnels from Gaza into not just Israeli land, but where civilians live. Not to where the IDF was based. To mosques, killing fellow Muslims. And synagogues and schools. They didn't care. The same mentality Yasser Arafat. It's not liberation, it's just destruction. And we know that at least 160 Palestinian children were killed. Not just the IDF, other very brave Arab reporters were telling people this. Unfortunately, most of the media got it wrong. Do you know that about 2 weeks ago, Amnesty International published a report, and it said that Hamas was sending missiles to destroy its own people? I'm sorry, that one too, the missiles in that part too, I'm sorry. This here, the torturing of the people in Gaza, and no one says anything about it, LA Times, and then this one here, the missiles part here. New York Times reported this, it got missed. When Amnesty International reported it a couple weeks ago, somebody sent it to me. I stood up from my chair. Way to go, Amnesty International. It's April, that was July, but hey, better late than never. You sat there and screwed the people who were getting killed, and you kept lying. Why were they doing that? Hamas would fire missiles at its own people, and then tell the television cameras come and say, see what the IDF did? See what the IDF did? And then CNN and everybody just lined up like ducks in a row. Today, it happened in Gaza, Israel won an incursion, blah, 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 blockade, blah, 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 blah. Palestinian human rights? Yes. Let's have a conversation about Palestinian human rights. This lady, her name is Christiana Stas. She's a Palestinian Christian who lived in the West Bank. who thought that Israel was the problem, that she got older and wiser, and she began to speak truth to power. And Fatah threatened her, and then she ran away. She lives in the UK now. She does what I'm doing right now all over the world, but with much more bravery, because she doesn't know which day is going to be her last. Her family still lives in the West Bank. One of the reasons why they're still alive is because when they first started threatening her again once she was gone, she did a videotape recording and a direct appeal to Saeb Erekat, the chief Palestinian negotiator, and basically said to him, you promised rule of law, you promised fairness, you promised justice, please. She basically put him on Front Street. It's one of the only reasons why her family is still alive. Otherwise, they'd be gone. And she's speaking truth to power. Not only that, where she's from, and she talks about it. Honor killings in the Palestinian Authority is up over 200%. For those of you who don't know what that is, that's when the male member of the Arab family couldn't kill the woman for any given reason, the mom, the sister, for anything. I don't like what you wore, I don't like what you said. And it's basically legal. Some of the longest jail sentences that happened passing about 6 months. This is going up. What's the significance of that? Mahmoud Abbas, the Palestinian Authority, are vying for statehood. And the closer they get, the more they abuse the rights of their people. Why? That's what despots do. Do you know that the closer that we get to a nuclear deal with Iran, they're hanging more people? Why? Because they don't want their people to see them as soft. They're saying to them, we may be talking to Washington, but don't you get it twisted. And they're hanging more for frivolous offenses, for nothing. Just say, they're already hanging homosexuals for being homosexual. They're just hanging people for whatever. And they're doing it to let everybody know we're still strong. This is what's going on in the West Bank right now. It's so bad in Gaza. Gazans are leaving in rickety, what we call refugee boats. They call them death boats because many of them are sinking on the open seas. Hamas was responsible for sinking one of them. There's some 500 people on one of them. This is a couple of months ago. Of that 500 people, most of them were children. And Hamas laughed at them while they died. CNN reported this. Palestinian human rights? Yes. Let's talk about Palestinian human rights. And what I call the coup de grace, the one that chaps my hide more than anyone. While Students for Justice in Palestine goes all over the country lying to black student unions and African student unions and Latino unions about stand with us against the evil white imperialists, they are the PR firm for slave traders. Yes, of the money that Hamas makes, they make money on trafficking of Sudanese and Eritreans. How? They leave their lands and they're trying to either get to Israel or to Europe. They have to go through the Sinai, where they are trapped by Bedouin traffickers. And Hamas is working with them. They kidnap them and they offer them back to their families for some $2,000, which most of them can't pay. So they just sell them to Mauritania or Saudi Arabia. Well, Saudi Arabia, illegalized slavery, yeah, whatever. Tell that to Kenya. There's Kenyan slaves in Saudi Arabia right now. So I take it personally when SJP lies to my black students all over the country. Apartheid state. And I'm still waiting for an answer. When are you, SJP, going to condemn the open slave trade that Hamas is? There's slave trading going right on in Gaza right now. And one of the reasons why we know this is true is because Israel, where there's a rule of law, some of those rings have been busted, these people have been arrested, fined, and in prison. This is why we know it's true. We have Israeli court documents that actually have exposed all of this. Stand with your Arab brothers of color. Whatever, man. Makes me angry. And all this happens with the full consent of the UN. I need to show you this one last thing. You might get a little mad at me, it's okay. I'm gonna get mad with a purpose.
Throughout the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Palestinian representatives and their supporters have systematically used the UN's main institutions to launch high-profile investigations against Israel for alleged war crimes. However, these charges have been proven time and again to be false. Example number 1. In April 2002, after Israel was struck with a wave of suicide bombing attacks, Israeli troops entered the Jenin refugee camp in the West Bank, described by Palestinians as the capital of suicide attacks. Palestinian leaders accused Israel of carrying out a massacre.
The massacre in Jenin and the massacre in the old city of Nablus.
Saeb Erekat called for an international commission of inquiry and claimed at least 500 Palestinians were killed. Yasser Abedrabo contended that among the 500, many were women and children. The UN took the Palestinian leaders at their word. Secretary General Kofi Annan spoke about grave violations by the IDF and dispatched UN investigators. Yet, after the damage caused to Israel's reputation, the UN investigation concluded that the accusations were false. There was never a massacre in Jenin. Example number 2. In December 2008, after constant Palestinian rocket fire on Israel, the Israel Defense Forces entered Gaza in an attempt to protect its southern cities. Palestinians accused Israel of deliberately targeting civilians. A fact-finding team appointed by the UN Human Rights Council and headed by Justice Richard Goldstone initially accepted the Palestinian accusations. However, Justice Goldstone later retracted the main claim against Israel. Example number 3. In May 2010, the Israeli Navy stopped a flotilla of 6 ships on their way to Gaza. Israel was accused of imposing an illegal naval blockade and denying civilians access to food and humanitarian aid. UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon empowered the Palmer Commission to investigate the claims. The Palmer report concluded that the blockade was legal under international law and that there was no humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Moreover, Israel did not block humanitarian aid from entering Gaza by land. In the month prior to the flotilla alone, over 17,000 tons of aid entered Gaza. The markets of Gaza were, in fact, full of fresh produce. These are just 3 well-known examples. The Palestinians' fabrications against Israel have been proven time and again to be a systematic abuse of international institutions, aimed at discrediting and delegitimizing the State of Israel. However, hijacking the agenda of the United Nations by Palestinians comes with a price. As early as November 2006, the UN Secretary General Kofi Annan criticized the UN Human Rights Council. Since the beginning of their work, they have focused almost entirely on Israel, and there are other crisis situations like Sudan, where they have not been able to say a word. The systematic exploitation of international humanitarian law by Palestinians comes at the expense of others in need. It erodes the credibility of UN bodies, and it must come to an end.
I need 3 volunteers real quick so I can finish up. There's 3 people. You don't have to say anything, but I need you to come to the front. You have to do it, you're just going to stand where I ask you to stand. So there's 3 volunteers, get 3 people real quick. Wait, oh, you're a bit shy. Yes, ma'am, come on. Yes, sir, and then, yes, ma'am. Okay. Come in again, sorry. Brian, you stand right here in the middle, please. You are? Lisa. You stand over here in the end. And you are? Sharona. Brian's moving, so you're right here. Say it's Sharona. Sharona? Oh, ma'am, you stand right there, all right? Brian's the UNHRC. He's the United Nations Human Rights Council, so he's the bad guy. He's a nice guy, but right now he's a bad guy. They go, boo. Wow. You know, I got a good one for you, but you guys don't remember Nicolau Ceausescu. That's how old I am. You're Iran. She's Ronnie, and she's Ayatollah Khomeini. She's all the leaders of Iran all over there. She's the bad guy. Everybody say boo. Boo. Sharona's Israel. Brian's job is to let you, the international community, know when there's human rights violations, hence the term Human Rights Council. Matter of fact, unless he tells you, you don't know. You don't really have any way of checking out what's going on around the world, but he has, peacekeepers and observers all over the place. So Brian tells you when something's awry with you. Now, the Iranian leader here, slaughtering their own people. They're doing what they're doing right now, detaining people, hanging people, all kind of stuff, and they want to build a nuclear weapon to drop it on Israel, the little Satan, the Greeks, and the whole thing, all right? This is what she's doing. And she's oppressing the people, either dead, a lot of them are in jail, so she's just getting off and going hog wild. I know these Jewish people just Sharona's Israel. Humanitarian aid, all kind of stuff, all the wars, all kind of stuff. So now what's happening is that you don't know what Lisa is doing. I should call it by name. You don't know what Iran is doing because Brian's not telling you. And the reason why he's not telling you is because of the wealth that she has access to. She's squeezing the palms. She's kind of going to you don't know these. You don't know. And Brian likes that yacht. He likes sending his kids to the best school, his Swiss chalet, all that kind of stuff. Living large in the top, big pimping. So he ain't trying to mess this up right here. So she's boom, Brian's cool. And the one thing that they also agree on other than the money is that they hate cannot stand Israel. So not only does Brian not tell you what Iran is doing, he passes resolution after resolution after resolution condemning Israel. So not only do you not know, Brian goes so far, he likes to have National Iran Day. So you could hear about all the wonderful things that Iran is doing. And it has the UN seal of approval. Who reads UN reports? High schoolers, political science majors, international law students. Because once it gets that seal on it, man, you know that thing is real. This is how anti-Zionism is going on. And who's paying the biggest price? People from poor countries. 5 million people died in the Congo between 1995 and 2005, and most of you didn't even know it. And you won't know, because it's not Israel. 148 Christians were just killed by Al-Shabaab in Kenya. 30 of them, Coptic Christians in Libya, by ISIS. Another 21 Ethiopian Christians. Why? Because it's not Israel. Do you know that the UNHRC just passed another resolution condemning Israel as the worst violator of women's human rights on the planet? Not Saudi Arabia, where women can still be decapitated and can't drive. Israel, where you have female members of the parliament, leaders in the military, doctors, lawyers, Israel. And kids are reading those reports. Even if you're not Jewish, even if you're not Zionist, people care less about Israel. If you're a human being, millions of people are dying. In the Yarmouk camps of Iraq, thousands of Palestinian refugees slaughtered. Where's SJP? Where's CARE? Nowhere. Israel sneezed. Oh my God! Who's paying the price? I have many Nigerian friends. Boko Haram slaughtering since 2012. Folks hashtagging bring back our girls. Screw you, bring back our girls. Do something about it. Say something about it. Makes me feel like a big man to hashtag something. Make noise about the fact that the UN is not saying anything about it. But plenty about Israel. Even if I didn't like Jewish people, even if I didn't care anything about Israel, I care that people are dying. Remember that graphic I showed you? He said 40% of the UN resolutions? That video was 5 years old. Let me bring you up 45%. 45% of what the UNHRC does is completely libel this country. While the other countries, and so what happens is that since she's got that good gig going, North Korea, Sudan, tell me your name again?
Lisa.
Hey Lisa, how you get that hook up, man? How you do that? Oh, easy. You know what? If you just give Brian whoop, 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 you get to do whatever, man. And I'll give you a plaque and everything. Wow, really? And I hate Israel anyway, man. Cool, let's do that. It's been going on for a long time. So when black students get duped on campuses, say not only are they laughing at you while they're enslaving Sudanese and Eritreans, there are other Africans being slaughtered. While you talk about free Palestine, while you talk about from the river to the sea, which is a genocidal call from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, that's the entire thing, people. That's what's actually going on. Oppression, genocide. No, there's real genocide going on. It's just not happening in Israel. But it is happening in lots of other places. Thank you very much, everybody. You guys. Let's finish it up real quick, all right? That's the last part we just did. It's really, really bad, but I'm not going to leave you in the bad. We're going to finish with the good, all right? A couple minutes, all right? Israel's justice. Can I give you this little quick snapshot, please, and we'll be finished? Check this out.
Innovation Africa links Israel innovation to African villages.
Let's juxtapose for a quick second.
Mothers are now coming because now we have the light we can use for conducting deliveries.
Solar energy helped me that it's night.
Solar water traffic and
This is not new, and this is not a publicity stunt. Israel gets its independence in 1948, the first sub-Saharan African nation to get it afterward from the same British colony, British power, was Ghana, 1957. And Israel and Ghana have been like this ever since, which is why most of my African diaspora friends, whether from the West Indies or from the continent, understand and appreciate the long-standing relationship. Kenya and Angola and then Senegal and on and on and on. Save a Child's Heart, which doesn't just save children from poor countries, it actually takes those other people from those countries, trains them to do the surgeries themselves, and sends them back. The cynical Israelis are just doing that for publicity. What the heck? Are you kidding me? They're spending all that money, giving them medical technology so that they look better? I'll take that cynicism every day. As opposed to the Arab oil-producing countries lifting their prices and still scream with the African nations now. Blair Underwood just last year went and visited Haifa, Rambam Hospital in Haifa, and he visited my good friend Dr. Carl Scoressi, who's leading the team that has actually discovered the cause of African American kidney disease. They know what it is, they've localized the gene, and they're working on a cure. And Blair was just completely impressed.
First of all, I'm visiting Israel, my first time ever in my whole life. So it's a dream come true for me to be here. We are here specifically at Rambam. Well, first of all, I traced my ancestors through a show back home called Who Do You Think You Are? And found out my people are from Cameroon, West Africa. And then Avi, who's hosting us here, mentioned about the work that Dr. Carl is doing here with kidney and finding out about kidney disease, specifically with continental Africans and African Americans, how it's linked. And of course, as an African American, I'm interested in that. So I'm so honored to have this time, and he put how many 4 years of research, or a lifetime of research really, into about 10 minutes, which I appreciate, but it's quite fascinating and interesting.
I'm almost finished, I really am. It's about Boko Haram in Nigeria, the one nation that's been helping Nigeria more than anyone. Guess what? The whole time it's been there. Nigeria thoroughly appreciates this relationship and doesn't understand African American anti-Zionism. Like, how are you African American to understand what Israel means? They don't get it. I get those questions all the time from my friends. So let's end it right here. I'm going to do a speed reading, thing will be done. Ready? We're going to do this in like 70 seconds. Ready? From finding the cure for Ebola to establishing field hospitals to mend the wounded in the Syrian civil war to helping Nigeria bring back our girls to performing life-saving heart surgeries on children from around the world to providing earthquake relief in Haiti to building academic libraries in Angola to building pediatric oncology wards in Kenya to building solar-powered schools throughout Africa to discovering the cure for African American kidney disease to aiding the Igbo Hebrews who faced annihilation by the Nigerian government while most of the world remained silent, to taking in Vietnamese refugees when no other country would, to enrolling and graduating Sudanese and Eritreans at the prestigious IBC, to allowing the leaders of BDS into Tel Aviv University, to helping clean up the Ganges River in India, to being a first responder during Hurricane Katrina and Hurricane Sandy and fighting famine in Somalia, and you can go ahead and put Nepal on there as well, to training Ghanaians in cutting-edge agricultural tech and irrigation technology, to rescuing African refugees in the Sinai who faced organ harvesting and slavery, to providing the only safe haven for religious minorities in the Middle East, to returning the worldwide Jewish diaspora to their homeland, to taking in non-Jewish refugees, to admitting sworn enemies of the Jewish people and their family members into the Israeli hospitals. Can you imagine what Israel could do if it didn't have to spend so much time defending itself against annihilation? Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.
Dumisani, wasn't that remarkable, ladies and gentlemen?
Thank Brian for making this possible. CUFI Campus was dedicated to bringing conversations and presentations like this all over campuses across America to have an important conversation about Israel and to get a side of Israel that you really probably don't hear. 9 times out of 10, what was presented tonight, many people have not heard. And so thank you, Dumisani, and thank you to all our partners that helped to make this possible tonight. At this point, we want to open up the floor for question and answer. We ask you to not make statements, but to ask questions. We want this to be a dialogue. And I don't know how much longer we have, maybe about a half an hour or so until we have to go to this room. But we definitely want to have an opportunity to have some healthy dialogue with Dumisani. So at this point, question and answer now.
Yeah, first of all, thank you for coming, Pastor Washington. I think you've shown just how awful and dysfunctional the UN can be. I mean, especially when you consider the General Assembly, each country gets a vote regardless of population. It doesn't make any sense, right? So I guess my question is, how can Americans work to change that and work to make a better system because, we vote for presidents, representatives, and then the president, appoints an ambassador and they get one vote. How can we make that a better system?
So you talk about the political part of it. One of the reasons why I thoroughly enjoy being involved with Christians United for Israel, my friend David Walker and the others, is that is also the political part of it. Each time we go to the Washington, D.C. summit, we actually go to Capitol Hill and we talk to our representatives. We talk to our congressmen and our senators. And we tell them about, we have talking points, whether we're talking about the Iran nuclear deal or maybe even something suggesting the UN. So that's one of the ways that you can do it. Be a part of a group where your voice can be expanded. That can actually affect that type of change. Hillel Neuer runs an organization called UN Watch. It's powerful. I have videos that I sometimes show about what they're doing. They're actually there at the UNHRC making their own statements and criticizing, letting the world know what's actually going on, and they can list other people's support. So join those types of organizations so that you can both be aware and also see the other type of things that you can do to affect that type of change both in Washington and obviously in New York here. Okay. Thanks for your question? Yeah. It is a, I'm sorry.
Sorry. Hi, I also want to thank you for coming to speak. I really enjoyed and was moved by your presentation today. My name is Arabelle Shafay. I'm on the executive board of Aryeh, the pro-Israel group here. And my question is, what do you think the best strategy is for a pro-Israel group like Aryeh to reach out to people outside of the Jewish community and maybe not even Christian people? Because it's clear the connection between Christianity and Zionism, as you've spoken about, and obviously clear the connection between Judaism and Zionism, and so that's why we get some Jews in Aryeh. But how can we get not just support, but activism like yourself, from people outside of the Jewish community and who might not be religious here at home?
You have to have dialogue. You have to, it generally does not work if you're trying to just target a group, maybe a club group or even a community group. What you want to do is sit down with one of the leaders or representatives of that group and say, I want to have a conversation. I want to talk about Israel, I want to talk about human rights. And you sit down and go to Starbucks. Just something where it's just informal. That's actually where it will start. From there it turns into maybe events together, those types of things. Oftentimes I was just at a school in Southern California and I presented a similar presentation to, there's a professor there who does political science, can't remember what it is, and one of her students who never even heard it before wrote a letter to her and she sent it to me. And he's becoming an activist. He's like, I didn't know this about the UN, I didn't know about, and again, he wouldn't consider himself a Zionist, but he is someone who's concerned about human rights. So that was his interest. And again, oftentimes you just have a dialogue about those things. Then you can kind of see where they are, then kind of hear your heart, and kind of go from there. So start with that one-on-one thing first. Just
I just wanted to ask you why you didn't mention more about Martin Luther King's views on Israel. For instance, after the 1956 Suez Crisis, he gave a sermon in which he called the Israeli, British, and French invasion an imperialist enterprise. And then also the fact that in FBI wiretaps, we also get to hear what Martin Luther King did say about Israel with his advisors to come up with what to say. Part of it was that they said that they needed to find some way to appease the Jewish constituencies that they required support from and required funding from. And that he also, in these FBI wiretaps, complained that he was being misrepresented about his stance about Israel, complaining that he was sounding more pro-Israel than he really was. And also, you didn't mention that when you talked about Bayard Rustin, that, well, he did support Israel, but his foreign policy was really, really neoconservative. For instance, Bayard Rustin supported apartheid South Africa in its intervention in the Angolan Civil War. And also, you didn't mention that Andrew Young, who was also a member of BASIC, was later fired from his role as UN ambassador because he spoke to the PLO.
Okay. Is this a question or are you trying to make a statement? We actually just ask questions. So
okay.
One question
okay.
for him.
My question is that.
And I'm aware of very good things that you're saying. I'm just waiting for you to finish.
Okay. Yes. My question is that, and it's a question for the Christians United for Israel as well. I'm wondering what you believe Martin Luther King would say about the fact that you work for Pastor John Hagee, who has referred to Hitler as a half-breed Jew who conducted the Holocaust on God's behalf, the Antichrist will be partially Jewish, as was Hitler, and that Jewish disobedience is responsible for anti-Semitism, and that Hurricane Katrina was God's punishment for homosexuality. And I also wonder why you believe that white privilege is a myth, and why you also stated that the Black Lives Matter movement is an ISIS cause.
This guy did his homework. The last thing you said was a blatant lie. So I didn't say that. You have to, seriously, I didn't. I know exactly what I said about it. I know exactly what I said about Black Lives Matter. So each of the things that you said, and you started off fraudulently about the Dr. Kings and went to all the other things like Andrew Young and his collaboration with the PLO. It had nothing to do with Dr. King, who had been dead for several years. So well, the whole premise of your question was completely false. Because the first thing that you said was that if this was about Dr. King, why didn't I address a couple of Dr. King things? And then you went to all these other things. Yeah, it's my turn. I get to talk now. No, that's fine.
I said you addressed bio
no,
so I brought up bio question. I said
I know exactly what you
brought up.
No. I heard all of that.
Would that be a problem? Why would?
Are you finished? Because what David was saying to you is that there's other people here, so you need to get to the lecture. Everything that you said, I'm fully aware of. And the presentation that I did was about Dr. King's legacy. His conversations, both pre-1968 and then later on, I should say pre-1967 and then later on, had to do with how he was going to say what he needed to say. He had those conversations with lots of people, not just with his advisors, he also had them with other constituents as well. Not because he was shamming, but because he needed to make a public statement. After the war, for example, there was a great deal of confusion because no one knew that Israel was going to preemptively strike Egypt, but Israel. And so he himself was taken off guard, and some of the conversations that you're referring to actually go to him saying, what does he need to say? By September of that same year, he'd already codified what he needed to say. He began to say the same thing up until the time of his death. So you're not introducing anything new, nor does it conflict anything to do with his solidarity stance with Israel or his advocating for the Arab people.
Have you read the FBI transcripts?
I've seen most of them, yes.
Because the last time someone brought that up, you said that you didn't even read those FBI transcripts.
That is not what I said. If you're talking about Missouri, that's not what I said to him.
On Twitter.
On Twitter?
Someone included me on this Twitter.
Yes, I saw that. I remember that conversation. And he did what you're trying to do now, and he tried to take what Dr. King said, and I pointed out to him that it was 1960. So was you. I pointed out to you that it was 1967.
I posted the FBI transcript.
And then you tagged me.
I didn't. Someone else did.
Right. And so then we had it. So who was the conversation with, him or you?
It was some third party
okay.
who was supporting you and asked you if these FBI transcripts were correct.
Yes, and then what did I say to him?
You questioned the accuracy of the transcripts.
I questioned when it was, did you remember me point out what the date was? Do you remember me telling him this was 1967? Do you remember that part?
I remember you talking about it.
Because, well, that's a huge, if you're going to remember some of it, my friend, you should remember the most important part. When I pointed out it was 1967, I was telling you exactly the same thing I'm saying right now. It was after the war when there was a great deal of confusion and Dr. King was trying to figure out what was actually going on. I don't think that the IDF was giving him information. He got it later on like everybody else. And those were the questions. That was the thing that you posted on Twitter.
Didn't do your homework.
Alright, I actually have a question. But thank you, we're going to go to another
Next
question.
Also, your
no, it's not your turn.
Excuse me, your time is up. Your time is up. We're going to another question. Please be respectful of other people.
You said you made a lot.
Sir.
I appreciate the point that you brought up. I'd like to think that if Dr. King were alive today, and I want to preface this by saying, unlike this gentleman, I'm not trying to catch you in a lie here or anything like that.
Yes, I'm listening to speak.
I would imagine that Dr. King would recognize all the great things that Israel brings to the world today, so many of which you've highlighted in your presentation. But I would wonder, from a man who said, we will not be satisfied when the Negro in Mississippi cannot vote, what he would say in 1968. Maybe he said, yes, it's important that Israel has a right to exist. I wonder what he would say about the more than 1 million Palestinians living in the West Bank, who since 1967 have not had the right to vote for the government, for the
Israeli government,
for the military, for the law that governs them in that land, which is separate from the Israeli government. It's a military law. My question is, what do you think Dr. King would have said about that? Do you think that he could have both acknowledged the great contributions that Israel brings to the world, and also acknowledged that there are unacceptable breaches of Israel's democracy that have been gone on for many, many years without any real sign of stopping?
Okay, so first thing, you're asking me a question, and I'm careful to say this on my lectures. I'm not saying what he would say right now. I'm telling you, like I said at the beginning, what he said and what he said in context. That's the first thing.
I'm asking you what you
I know what you said. Now it's my turn. I don't understand why you guys don't get to the point that after you get to ask a question, then somebody gets to answer it.
No, I'm not, just because people want to make sure that the question that
I'm answering your question. I'm answering your question. That's the first thing I want to get straight, the premise of the part of it first. Secondly, if you're talking about, you're saying the vote for the military, so what you have then in the West Bank or the Palestinian Authority is even a cooperative effort between the Palestinian Authority and the Israeli military. There is, not to mention the fact that while we're talking about voting, Abu Mazen hasn't had an election since 2005. So he might actually say something about that as well. So what you're talking about are security concerns, which everyone could probably admit here are not the best thing, but they are something that Israel and the Palestinian Authority has to work out. I'm not speaking to that because that's something that the Israeli government and the Palestinian Authority has to do. What Dr. King would say about that, who knows what he would say about that? What does that have to do with what he said before he was killed?
Nothing.
Okay, so I don't understand the point of the question. You premised the question on what he would say about it now, and I said, what does that have to do with what he said now? You're talking about security concerns. You're talking about the coordination of security between the Palestinian Authority and the Israeli government.
Respectfully, I think that's what you're talking about. I said nothing about security concerns. What
I said that's what they are. You mentioned the military.
I'm not talking about the military. I'm talking about, and somebody please correct me if I'm wrong.
You are.
Did I say, I could have sworn you.
I'm talking about the military law, the civil administration that governs the West Bank. If you watch the movie, perhaps The Law in These Parts, you'll learn about it's complex. Israel did not expect to take the West Bank in 1967 when Arab armies were amassing around Israel. All of a sudden they have this land, there are all these Palestinians. How are we going to deal with this? It's challenging.
Yes.
And since then, Israel has maintained legal control over that land through a separate body.
I think if I could just clarify the question. What he's talking about, there's like 3 levels of law in the West Bank. There's the like municipal law that the Palestinian Authority has in place, which in addition to having normal codes and things like that, also bans the sale of land to Jews with the death penalty.
Okay.
No, that's one level. I know.
I'm talking now. You can ask a question after.
The second is Israeli military law, which does govern Palestinian movement and freedom and things like that. And the third is there's this like hodgepodge of different types of laws, Jordanian law and Ottoman law and things like that, which are just relics that have simply just not been worked out by Israel. And I think that's what he's saying is very difficult.
I appreciate the clarification.
Yeah. Not trying to.
I mean, you're.
No. I'm just.
And truly, I asked this question like with deep love for Israel. I've spent over a year of my life in Israel.
Okay. You asked which question? Do you remember the question?
What I'm asking you is, what do you think Martin Luther King would say? As a man.
You asked this question.
And I addressed it in my opening statement.
I addressed it.
I addressed it multiple times.
Or
did he redirect and address security concerns?
No, I think he's talking about the underlying issue, the security issue that he's trying to
security is a. I'll ask the question in 5 words.
You already asked the question 3 times.
Yeah, you already answered the question. Are you a student at Columbia University? Sorry, sir, we need to move on.
Why don't you learn English?
We need to move on. Thank you for your question.
Excuse me, can I ask you a question?
Yes, sir.
Yes, just to reclarify, there are 3 sections to the so-called West Bank, Judea and Samaria: A, B, and C. C is controlled by Israel only. There are about 50,000 so-called Palestinians in Area C. Area B is jointly controlled between the PA, the Palestinian Authority, and Israel. And Area A is only controlled by the Palestinian Authority. Area A is the largest number of Palestinians in it, and it has the right to vote in Palestinian elections if they had any elections, which they don't. So it's on them to have elections. Area B would be under Palestinian control, not under Israeli control. They would give it to them. That's the next stage. If they would ever keep the agreement they started in the first place, which not keeping. Okay? And Area C is under Israeli control, which I hope we annex. Go ahead.
Thank you, sir. Question right here.
So I have a question. So this gentleman right here in the middle, who doesn't speak English probably, had a question. How come the Palestinians are not allowed to vote in the Palestinian elections? I mean, how long does the Palestinian presidency last? Is it
I
like,
pointed out that Abu Mazen was elected several years ago.
yeah, but it's a 4-year term, a 5-year term, and it's been already a lot longer than that. And how is it that they, they always talk about different, how do you call it, where they live? In the tents, the refugee camps. Where are they? How come you don't see the, like people live in the tents in Syria or something? Where are they? I've been to Israel, I haven't seen them. Can you please?
Refugee camps?
Yeah, I mean, refugee camps, I'm thinking it should be, tents, UN provided.
They use that term euphemistically. Yes, and which I'm sure you know. Refugee camp can refer to any number of places, like including in Syria, unfortunately, where they have houses, but they can't actually fix up those houses. And they can't have citizenship, including in several other Arab Muslim countries where they're not allowed to have citizenship because they are perpetual refugees. There are Palestinians who live in the United States who still have refugee status. I talked with several of them when I was in San Jose State last year. We had a very, very rigorous conversation about what that status actually means. We talked about how the fact that Palestinians are the only ethnicity on the planet who have perpetual or at least ongoing generational refugee status. It happens for no other people, just like the UN has no other organization within it, the UNRWA, which is set aside for one group of people in a $2 billion budget to administer that the leaders are stealing. So to answer your question, I've been to Israel a couple of times too. I haven't seen any camps.
I'm still waiting.
Yes, sir.
Question right here in front.
Okay, here's a question that does not have an agenda.
Thank you.
Okay, so in response to the original status where there was a comparison between Gaza and Ferguson, I'm wondering, because you focused a lot on like the Palestinian so-called injustices of their people or
Yes.
other kinds of people, and I'm wondering how you would respond to, or I guess how this comparison between Gaza and Ferguson and that kind of resistance, and whether you think that's an accurate comparison or not.
It is completely inaccurate. And I've addressed this before. I've addressed it on social media, I've addressed it in my speeches. For whatever is going on, even now, whether it's Ferguson, whether it's Baltimore, whether it's Oakland, not too far from where I live, as difficult of all those situations, everything from police to economics to social policies from the 1960s, because all these things are part of the discussion, which are very much debated in the African American community. That has nothing to do with Gaza, that is ruled by Hamas, that slaughters its own people. That has nothing to do with the fact that the Palestinian people, one of the things we talked about, I'll show you those missiles, all that kind of stuff, they're very, very brave Gazans who have given their lives. For example, during the last Operation Protective Edge, who helped the IDF because they recognized that their oppression was actually coming from their own leaders. The New York Times just posted about 2 or 3 days ago how about certain Gazans were arrested and abducted because they were actually protesting Hamas. So that is not the same thing as whether it's police brutality, a certain amount of access in terms of the African American community, inner city problems, schooling, those types of things. What's similar, unfortunately, is what we see happening more and more with these protests. I see them, I follow them. I see the Palestinian flags flying around in New York and in Gaza and in Ferguson and in Baltimore. I've seen that, and it is a direct attempt. It's the same thing that Yasser Arafat did with Eldridge Cleaver when he approached the Black Panthers and said, our struggle is your struggle, which is why Eldridge Cleaver became an anti-Zionist until he saw what was actually real and he stopped. So when I say that, I say there's not a connection to it at all. As difficult as both those situations are, the Gazans are being destroyed by Hamas. And the African American situation is much more complex than that. There's much more than going on. And that's why I say they're not connected at all. It's people attempting to do that, but it is not what's actually happening. Yes, sir.
Good time for one more question. Go ahead. Which one? Did you pick some?
Oh no, I'm sorry. Well, I think there was, these guys were back to their Muslim nations hundreds of years ago. They have to pay the jizya tax and all of the types of things. And so many of them are wanting to speak out, but they're afraid to actually speak out. And then you have the Arab Israeli Christians, many of them who want to be called Aramean now, like Father Gabriel Nadav, who is as many may know him, he's a champion of Israel. He's a great Zionist, if you will. And he has put his life on the line. He's actually on the death watch as well because he's advocated for young Arab Israelis to serve in the IDF. And actually the number has increased exponentially over the last couple of years because of his efforts. So we are connected with him. We are aware of the Christians in both, the Palestinian Authority and also in Israel proper. So yes, sir.
Just take one more.
One more.
Take one more from this gentleman.
You mentioned the word earlier, outpost.
Yes,
That's
sir.
interesting to you.
Yes,
My question is, whose outpost? I think what you've shown in your talk tonight is that Israel, and not only Israel, but African countries, Arab countries, they are easily manipulated by oil prices, by all kinds of foreign pressures. So the former Soviet Union, American pressures, I think also. An outpost to me is a relic of imperialism. You have the last outpost, right, of a certain viewpoint. So whose outpost is Israel? Who does it belong to? And you know, and why should we pivot on this point here?
Well, I pointed it out for the isolated nature of the words, and I connected with outpost and with also oasis, because he said them together. So an outpost, and again, now you're asking me to surmise, like a couple of other people, and I can only surmise what he meant. I mean, I can't say exactly what he meant, but for me, he's talking about shared values, which is what talks about even in Israel, in the United States to this day, one of the most bipartisan issues in Washington is Israel. So they talk about democracy, and they talk about this connection, how Israel is they call it the front line against terror, those types of things. So to me, I think he's referring to that type of thing. Is that exactly what he's saying? I couldn't say. The oasis part to me is even more clear because, again, surrounded by countries that are not like it. So that's why I pivoted on this, my own personal thing. I pivoted on it because the wording that he chose, Dr. King seemed to choose words carefully, and so that was something that just kept it out to me. That was the only reason why. To answer your question?
Yeah, I mean, well, I guess it is a bit more politically charged question that, you know, that perhaps the U.S. invests the energy that it does in Israel, and also the detractors of Israel invest the energy that they do because there are questions of what does the West really stand for here? Why would we invest so much?
Which is one of the reasons why my friend Caleb Meyer's video, the first one about the whole UN thing, is so good to me. It's like a very concise, but it tells you how the UN operates, the international bodies, those type of things. So yeah, I mean, nations make alliances with other nations. There's money. There's all those type of things. Absolutely. So was Dr. King aware of that? I'm sure he was. Was he denigrating it because of that? I don't think so. But yeah, that's a very international politics type of question. You know what I mean? Which is could kind of go on. So yeah, you know what I mean? Yeah. So
I gotta end it there. I hate we gotta be out here by 10, so we want to be respectful of the university. Let's give our speaker a our national summit. It's in Washington, D.C. It's July 13th to 14th. We have scholarships for students. If you want to be involved with CUFI, people of our activists in the audience, please go to CUFIcampus.org. Thank you so much.